Why do I think adventurer guilds, or at least something akin to it, would actually need to exist? Why do I believe that the existence of an adventurer guild-like institution would almost always come to be? Well, firstly, in a classic medieval Renaissance age magic fantasy universe, these organizations wouldn't necessarily be guilds. Instead, they could just be knightly orders, or a step down from knights, but still somewhat above commoners and the peasantry. Perhaps fighting in an adventurer's guild for a couple of years and committing some awesome feats would also be a way to even become a knight, or at least a sentry or bodyguard, for an important person or institution. But adventurers or other powerful individuals need some way inside the system in order to not cause chaos. And having established knightly orders, upstarts, and the rest of the adventurers all keeping each other in check would also balance the potential instability that these armed forces carry with them, not to mention that they would be fighting a constant monster threat, which would also help balance them out and keep them focused on something different than, let's say, an uprising or a civil war. This brings us to the policing of the adventurers. It's something that, aside from Konosuba and some other shows, I've never really seen. A force may be composed of former adventurers who now have a steady job as guild guards, would also be tasked with policing and perhaps even taking down rogue adventurers. So the strength of the guild and the adventurers would be policed by themselves, rather than having an external force like knights coming in, because the adventurer guild is still a tremendous military force, and if enough adventurers get the idea that these outsiders just want to suppress them and mess with them, or take away their hard-earned coin, they might decide to defend whoever's accused. And this might be all that is needed during tough times, cold winters, and scarce quests, to start a rebellion. And finally, all of this brings us to the main reason why adventurer guilds or something akin to it would exist by necessity, because in general, any fantasy world filled with magic and monsters would need a way to collect and organize powerful individuals that would inevitably pop up. Let me paint you a picture of how this would happen. Let's say out of 1,000 peasants, 100 would fight a monster during their youth to protect their home. This doesn't need to be anything huge. 2 orcs, a band of goblins, a pack of great wolves, or something like that would be enough to force the villagers into taking action themselves. And they wouldn't do it alone, or in a party of 4, but in larger groups. Perhaps a couple dozen individuals hunting a particularly large wolf, or something similar. They kept it at bay with makeshift wooden spears or pitchforks, while others fling rocks at it. Maybe 1 or 2 bowmen would also join in and unleash some arrows until the beast is dead. And perhaps 20 out of these 100 would be fairly good at fighting monsters, and then they would do it more often. And 1 would be outright talented, outright gifted, doing a huge chunk of the work alone, being able to dodge the beast's attack, keeping track of it, and so on and so forth. This individual would likely become a professional monster hunter, whether there's an adventurer guild or not, since his village needs protection. He'd also likely recruit from the other 19 individuals who are also fairly good at fighting, and finance his endeavors by selling off the meat, the pelts, and other materials gained from these defeated foes. This in combination with some basic income provided by the villagers themselves, maybe just food and lodging, would be enough to make a good living for the young and upcoming monster hunter. And again, this would not be an isolated thing, but just a necessity in almost any village that is not regularly protected and patrolled by knights, that has no way to give away its most skilled fighters. So, over time, even without an adventurer guild, or even the concept of adventurers even existing, every village would have its own small professional standing army, which then would be quickly interconnecting themselves with other villages to take down larger prey and more dangerous beasts. Perhaps a wormling or an ogre, and by this logic just a couple hundred villages could muster a professional and battle-hardened military force of, let's say, 500 to 1,000 men, specializing in taking down larger beasts, making them the ideal counter for knightly forces, especially since creating a quagmire or swamp right in front of the knights would be really effective against them. Look up the Battle of Crécy or the Battle of Agincourt for more details, or just read or watch Mushoku Tensei. It's the same principle. With basic terrain attacks, larger prey and armies can be trapped equally, and then showered with projectiles from a safe distance. Again, watch Mushoku Tensei to understand the concept. Imagine that this gigantic red worm, this frenzied beast, would be an attacking army, and you can see and sense how big of a deal powerful adventurers would be. And this self-militarization out of necessity is why adventurers need to be collected, divested, and separated from their villages of origin. Otherwise, all that is needed to incite a civil war is a particularly bad harvest or bad government, and all hell breaks loose. Now, while villages themselves could be raided and destroyed, since the state could likely bring a greater total force to bear on an individual village, in order to simply cut off any recruitment opportunity for adventurers, individual adventurers who are likely stronger and harder, and know the land around their village like no other, and thus they would still persist, and now live on for revenge. So all you would have done is make them angry. And at this point, you will face a professional guerrilla force able to take down ogres, which over the years would just bleed your military dry, and thus leave you wide open from attacks from hostile nations, or other political factions that could make internal peace with the now rebel-turned adventurers. And while rebels are normally ill-equipped, and not as strong as regular military forces, relying on stealth, blending into the civilian population, and of course relying on their knowledge of the terrain to create a local superiority or set traps and ambushes, professional monster hunters, loyal to their now burned villages, would likely be the superior force on the battlefield, and could therefore freely challenge the arriving troops in greater numbers. Because of course all of the other villages would now have realized that this is a do or die situation. And therefore, the paladins, the monster hunters, the goblin slayers, and whoever else is part of the adventurer guild that has now formed would likely be able to destroy the incoming knights, even on an open battlefield, since the peasant armies that now are formed are supporting the adventurers. And of course the adventurers could be greeting the cavalry with fireball spells, crushing the full plate armors of knights with their ki-enhanced fists, or cast a poison mist, leaving the royal force to die slowly and in the middle of nowhere, not even making it to the battlefield. And even if they would lose, and even if another dozen of villages is burned to the ground, they could likely flee again and fight on. And so, over time, the royal forces would be bleeding, they would be suffering, they would be morally crushed, because no matter what they do, they can't pinpoint the adventurers. All they are left to do is slaying innocent civilians, old men, wives, children, knowing full well that they not only have a superior foe, albeit in inferior numbers, but that they also have wives and kids back at home. And so, all of this would deter any other royal forces from following their lord's commands. If you are being put to death either way, You could even try to overthrow the overly ambitious noblemen, rather than to try to destroy a bunch of orc and ogre slayers on their own home terrain. This might also be how medieval democracies could start. With 3 villages already cooperating in monster hunting, they'd already have the troops and knowledge to create a professional army for their own protection, bolstered with a civil militia. And since again, the underlying mechanisms that would produce more adventurers, namely individual villages being attacked by monsters and having some of their own people that are able to best them in a fight, that are fairly good at killing monsters, would just create more powerful and strong individuals that then could do this professionally, even in a medieval democracy made up of small, liberated villages and towns. An adventurer guild would sooner or later form again, even if the entirety of the former adventurers, of the former village protectors, would have been used up to create a self-defense force. Also, monster defense, depending on the fantasy world in question, could be such a pressing matter that it couldn't be left to the whims and wishes of politicians, kings, or a senate. Denying one kingdom help just because one rival empire decided that it would be a great way to weaken it, in order to then conquer it later, might just doom both states. If, for example, next year's violent migration becomes too much for the scheming empire to handle alone. And we have a neat example from Overlord to illustrate my point. After the invasion of the so-called evil deities, the theocracy of Slain, mankind's greatest and by far most powerful nation, had founded and built up the Adventurer Guild as an institution that is tailored to be politically neutral and a supranational organization with the sole goal of combating monstrous threats to humankind, while again being mandated to be absolutely neutral in any human-on-human conflict. Since Slain couldn't unite all of humanity under its banner, uniting a monster defense under an institution that it had founded was the next best thing to do. Now the adventurers were often mistrusted and treated with suspicion by the higher-ups of pretty much any other country they were in, simply because they represented a large body of armed and quite powerful individuals outside the control of the nation's respective rulers, but this was a small price to pay for more internal safety. Also, to come back to our own medieval democracy made up of villages and their respective hunters. These forces would sooner or later be divided into monster hunters, explorers, and so on and so forth. And they would be what we now understand as the normal adventurer guild, and as a standing army to defend their borders from outside threats on the other. And while both arms of the military will likely need to aid one another on several occasions, they would also specialize in their roles, simply because if you would conscript all adventurers into the military, there would simply be no one left to fight off monsters in war times. And again, these organizations are necessary because you would end up with a private military force loyal to their local community instead, if you don't provide protection from a overseeing organization, which again would lead to internal conflict, strife, and instability. Now, with all of that said, there also needs to be something in it for the adventurers, otherwise they would not join the guild and stay freelancers instead. In the world of Goblin Slayer, for example, tax benefits are offered, as in you don't pay any taxes at all if you work in these regulated institutions, and the chance of earning a knighthood or arable land or even becoming a minor nobility, not necessarily by bestowing a noble title on you, but by being strong and famous enough to marry into an already existing noble house. You would be bound into the system, as would adventurers be at large. And it would be a great motivator, and bestowing nobility among one single adventurer from a backward peasant village would also elevate all of his relatives. And remember, back in the time where women had lots of kids because most of them would die and their labor was needed in the fields, and later when the parents were old and couldn't work themselves, then an entire family with dozens upon dozens of people would also be brought into the fold and turn into a supporting pillar of the state, and likely into the dominant noble family in their own village, because they would be the only one noble family in their respective backwater village, and therefore not only neutralize the village as a potential source of instability, but turn any emerging strong individuals into candidates for marriage with the now established minor noble house, which in turn would secure their loyalty. And in turn, the already established noble house that had initially taken the adventurer under his wings could now point to have, if not a dragon, then at the very least a troll slayer or something akin to it in their family. And military strength is always a great way to earn, if not outright demand, respect and prestige. Especially if you could just have your newlywed niece fetch her hero, and let him then describe in great detail how he ripped the head off that one gigantic troll that threatened an entire city, and how dangerous and brutal he can be, and that he often has a very short fuse and is very defensive of his newfound family, before returning to talks about which of the many families attending the dinner should be allowed to send in a candidate for the recently vacant position of mayor of the nearby small town or village. Not to mention that knights were originally not these shining beacons of justice and whatever is right at the time, but military units, essentially medieval tanks, that needed to be bound to the state structure first, so that they would stop pillaging random villages. So we actually have, if not historic precedents, then at the very least something similar in Europe's own history. So, in one way or another, adventurers would be either bound to an institution or indeed be the ones who bring these institutions about in the first place. Whether they are called adventurer guilds, knightly orders taking